Dr. Thomas E. Woods, Jr., he's a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute and holds a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard, master's from MPhil, I guess, a PhD from Columbia. Boy, you've got a pretty big brain there, eh, Tom? Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Glad to be here.
All right. And I have almost probably about, I think most of your books are from the last few years, ever since I've been doing talk radio. Most recently, it's Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse. I bought a copy of it just recently on Amazon so I can give it to a friend. There's also Nullification, How to Resist Federal Tyranny in the 21st Century. That's probably one we're going to focus on a bit here. There's Meltdown, Free Market Look at Why the Stock Market Collapsed. And one of my favorites, I still think my favorite, just for enjoyable reading, is The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. That's a great read. I just want to thank you.
That was my biggest seller times a billion, just because that title, which I didn't come up with myself, is just marketing genius. So you're just so curious, what could be in this thing?
Yeah. In other words, all the stuff that your government school masters don't teach you in government school, but yet really happened anyway.
There you go. That's right.
So before we get into Nullification, could you tell us a little bit about the Ludwig von Mises Institute?
Yeah, to make a long story short, so nobody changes this station, Ludwig von Mises, is, for those of us who are interested in freedom, some of us have favorite economists, all right? I know that sounds dorky. Some of us have favorite economists, and Ludwig von Mises is mine, because this is a guy who, in the 20th century, at the lowest point for human freedom, I mean, in the 1930s, where the Nazis are spreading across the continent, and he's a free market Jewish intellectual. Like, this is a very bad combination for him.
Sure.
They're spreading across Europe. Mises feels like he's got to get off the continent entirely. He flees to the United States in 1940, continuing to speak against the Nazis and in favor of the free market and the international division of labor and against imperialism and autarky. And he gets to the U.S. at a time when the fashionable thing in academia is to be a Marxist or an interventionist, and Mises is viewed as this kind of quaint, little old-fashioned little man. He struggles to get academic recognition. By 1949, he's written his masterpiece, Human Action, 900 pages. Yale University Press publishes it. It becomes an academic bestseller. And this is a guy who spends his career not trying to cozy up to the powers that be, but saying the exact opposite of what they want to hear, so telling them that the political authorities are not the ones who can reverse the business cycle, can reverse recessions. They're the ones who cause them through their crummy central bank and through manipulating interest rates.
What's the last thing they want to hear, Tom? It's the last thing they want to hear.
Right. They're the great saviors. The thing is that, as Mises said, all political leaders hate a good economist, because a good economist reminds them of the limits of what it's possible for them to do. And the great thing is, even though Mises was shunned professionally and spat upon and ignored, and he died in 1973, the very next year, his colleague F.A. Hayek won the Nobel Prize for one of Mises' own theories. And now today, in the wake of the financial crisis, who were the only economists consistently to predict that this was coming? It was the followers of Mises, the so-called Austrian school economists. So the Mises Institute is dedicated to promoting the 1,000% vindicated point of view of Ludwig von Mises and getting the so-called Austrian School of Economics more and more recognition in the public eye, so that maybe in the future we can avoid these debacles.
Okay, that works. Now, just a little aside question before we dig into Nullification. You go out there and you say that you're an Austrian, that you belong to the Austrian school, and you're a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Does it help you pick up chicks at New York cocktail parties?
Well, you know what? It didn't in the past. But these days, I'm telling you, in some circles, it is almost kind of chic to be Austrian school. Now,
really?
Of course, I'm a happily married man, so I haven't tested this theory.
Oh, okay.
This is just my wild guess.
All right, very good. Let's focus into one of your books here, because I think it's very important, Tom, on what we're dealing with here in Southern Oregon. A number of years ago, the voters enacted the Oregon Medicinal Marijuana Program. OMMP is how we refer to it, in which we're allowed to grow and have medicinal marijuana. You're allowed to have a certain amount of it. It doesn't mean you're allowed to sell it, on the street and this and that and the other. We are having a problem with that happening anyway, be that as it may.
Yeah.
But what concerns me is that effectively what the state of Oregon did, what the voters did twice, we voted on this, is nullified federal law, but yet the federal government is still swooping in with the DEA. Local law enforcement helps them out. What is the history of nullification, and why is this such a powerful tool? And yet I swear my state comrades just don't get it. Don't get it why this is so important and why they should be up in arms over this.
You're right. Well, first, nullification is not John C. Calhoun's idea. It's Thomas Jefferson's idea that the states have to be the last resort bulwarks of the liberties of the people, that the federal government has no incentive at all to limit itself. Well, why would it want to? Why would it want to have fewer powers rather than more? It has no incentive to limit itself. So the states are the logical candidates to do the limiting, to interpose themselves between their people and the federal government when an unconstitutional law is being enforced upon them. And this was made clear. It's not something that Jefferson just thought up one day after, a heavy drinking bout the previous night. It comes right out of the records of the Virginia Ratifying Convention in Richmond in 1788, where that the key people at the convention were making clear that Virginia was ratifying this very limited document, the Constitution. They were subject only to the powers listed in there, and if the federal government should reach for any additional power, then Virginia would simply be exonerated from it because we never agreed to it. Well, that's really all Jefferson is saying. He's reiterating this original understanding that Virginia had. And when you look at the history of it, now you would get the impression, based on all the propaganda we got in school, is that whenever you have political decentralization or the states doing anything, this is always code word for slavery and segregation.
Right.
But to the contrary, when you look at the history of nullification, it was used to fight for free speech in 1798. It was used to fight against unconstitutional searches and seizures in the early 19th century. It was used to fight against the prospect of military conscription in 1814. It was used for free trade, and it was actually used not to support slavery. I mean, think about it. Why would the South have needed to nullify any federal laws on slavery? All the federal laws were in favor of slavery. They don't need to nullify those. To the contrary, it was the North nullifying laws. The North, particularly Wisconsin, nullified the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and said, look, no, you're not just going to come into our state with your crummy federal marshals and point to some guy and say, yeah, that kind of looks like the slave we had. I think that slave matches the physical description we're looking for, so we're just going to take him. No one's going to be taken out of this state without a proper jury trial. So it was never used on behalf of slavery. It was always used against it. And so in this case, I think, given that we have a regime that is so arrogant and that regardless of which political party occupies power, is engaging in power grabs that would have been unthinkable to our ancestors, I think we have to put on the table ideas that we might have disparaged or laughed at in the past or said, oh, that's too extreme. No, the only extreme thing going on in the country is a federal government that thinks it can just make up the rules as it goes along. And if you ask it, what's your constitutional justification for overriding state medical marijuana laws, the constitutional arguments are so laughable that no one could possibly take them seriously.
Professor Thomas E. Woods, Jr., Senior Fellow, once again, Ludwig von Mises Institute. We're talking about nullification. I'm going to play for you a section of a Channel 5 interview that the TV folks had with Republican Congressman Greg Walden from our area about OMMP. So you can hear what he had to say about this.
About the battle between state and federal laws and medical marijuana. What is your stance on that?
You know, I've never been a supporter of the medical marijuana law in Oregon, and I think we see the kind of problems it causes. I've done the flyover with law enforcement, and so I think the feds are going to win out in this debate. There's only certain limits the state has, and when you run up against the federal law, I think you got a problem.
Okay. So, Tom, is Congressman Walden correct when he says, well, there's only limits to state power? When you run up against the federal government, it almost sounds like he's taking that supremacy clause of the Constitution and saying, well, if the federal government says jump, you just say how high, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that is a typical argument. I should address that. In the Constitution, there's a clause that says that, I'm paraphrasing, but it says, this Constitution and laws which shall be made in pursuance thereof are the supreme law of the land. And that's what the typical law professor will say when you mention nullification. And it just shows how superficial most law professors are, frankly. Because obviously that's what he thinks the supremacy clause means is that federal law trumps state law.
Right.
Well,
that's very
okay.
common. That's why I get it from listeners. I get the emails all the time. I mean, come on.
No, this is absurd. Absolutely absurd. I mean, you've got to, before you open your mouth on the Constitution, if you haven't looked at any of the documentary records of the state ratifying conventions, which takes a lot of effort and time, then you're frankly not entitled to an opinion. Now, it does not mean that, because basically what he wants the clause to mean is this Constitution plus laws which shall be made in pursuance thereof, plus any old laws we might want to impose on you are the supreme law of the land. Well, it clearly does not say that, and no one in his right mind would have ratified it if he thought it might one day say that. What it says is that this Constitution plus constitutional laws shall be the supreme law of the land. Nobody's disputing that. But what do you do when you have an unconstitutional law? The Supremacy Clause does not apply there. I mean, if they passed a law that said all redheads are to be put in detention camps immediately, we would not have to stand there scratching our heads saying, well, after all, there is a Supremacy Clause.
Yeah, you
Supremacy
bet.
Clause is not applicable in a case like that. That's the point. It begs the question entirely to cite the Supremacy Clause. Now, I think also what the congressman is hinting at is, he doesn't like the law anyway, so he's perfectly happy to see the feds come in and crush something he doesn't like. That's a very typical thing. Go get the big bully and bring him to the playground and to get your way.
It would appear then that our local sheriff, who is tacitly helping the drug enforcement, the DEA, to accomplish these raids, also feels the same way. I'm just presuming that would be the case.
I would focus popular anger on the sheriff's office. We have no control over the federal government. They don't care about us. I don't go for this comic book version of things whereby these are wonderful, selfless crusaders for justice who just have our well-being at heart. No, they don't. They want to perpetuate their own fiefdoms, whether it's at the Department of Justice or wherever. That's what they care about, is preserving their fiefdoms and increasing their budget and their power. That's what they do not care about us. So focus your anger on the local sheriff, because he is the chief law enforcement official. And if you have a sheriff who would say, look, I am not going to cooperate with this, and I may even throw roadblocks in your way. And if you then had another sheriff who got his courage bucked up by his example, who said he's not going to cooperate, and then another and another and another, then the federal government would decide we've got to pick our battles here. And is it really so important to keep people who are suffering from excruciating pain? Is it so important to keep them in agony that we have to have a showdown with all these local sheriffs, which is a lose-lose, by the way, for the federal government? I have this on good authority. The federal government does not want a showdown with a local sheriff, because everybody loves the local sheriff, and it just loses for them. Democrats bail on them, Republicans bail. They support their local sheriff. So that's what we need to see. Is just something other than, well, then let's just roll over again. Let's let the federal government do whatever it wants, just step all over us, treat us like garbage, not allow us to govern ourselves. At some point, you have to stand up and say, we're just not going to let you do this anymore.
Professor Thomas E. Woods, Jr. here once again. It's 8:24. Tom, I also emailed the governor, the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice responded to me, and the state attorney general says that, the federal government says that we're not going to, that they still think that it violates their law, so we're going to defer to them. And the governor, I want to let you know what Governor Kitzhaber did when I raised the issue of nullification and state sovereignty, and you aren't going to go to bat for the Oregon state law. And he said, well, here is the phone numbers and addresses of the U.S. congressmen and the U.S. senators for our state. Maybe you should call them. That's what our governor said, Tom. In other words, the boss, the chief executive, the guy in the state of Oregon.
Yeah, they're all scared, and they all. If he really had principles, like if his blood were really boiling from moral outrage, which it ought to be in this case, it ought to be boiling. This is clearly a power the states have, and it's not even a power. It's a power not to exercise power. It's a power to leave people alone. Clearly, they have this. The federal government clearly does not have the power to intervene here. As I say, the arguments they've used are absurd. We talk about them a bit in a book I co-authored called Who Killed the Constitution, in the chapter on medical marijuana. The arguments are unbelievable that they use. So, Yeah, as I say, at some point you have to just stand up and do it. Now, it's difficult. It's true these days because the federal government has the states right where they want them. You know, the federal government has given the states money, and the states are afraid to upset it. But in 2005, when 24 states nullified the Real ID Act, both on fiscal grounds and civil libertarian grounds, well, no state was penalized. No state had any money taken away. The federal government typically doesn't want to have that type of like your representatives in Washington don't want to be voted out of office because they presided over your state being stripped of money. So I think you could at least try to call their bluff. But if not, I'll tell you what's coming is there is a federal bankruptcy coming at some point. There are no budget cuts coming. The Democrats won't cut the welfare state. Most Republicans won't either. The Republicans won't cut the warfare state. Most Democrats don't want to do that either. So we get these cosmetic, trivial arguments about cutting nothing. And eventually that means that the money's going to run out. And then it becomes harder for the federal government to intimidate the states. There'll be much more. The states will realize they got to sink or swim on their own, that the federal government is not going to be able to bribe their governors into compliance anymore. And then I think we'll see a real flourishing of letting 100 flowers bloom and getting back to a little something of what the original America was supposed to be like.
I'm good with that. Professor Woods, at this moment in time, though, is liberty rising, kind of marching or marking time, or falling in the United States of America?
I think it's a paradoxical situation. I think the ideas of liberty, where that we're talking about issues like this, or the Federal Reserve, and it's no longer considered crankish to wonder about, gee, this is the institution that creates the money. Maybe I should look into this. These sorts of ideas are getting a lot of traction, more than they ever have in my lifetime, and that's a great sign. But at the same time, it seems like the federal government is just racing toward more and more power and control, and racing toward the fiscal crisis that's coming. So we have the best prospects we've ever had, but we also have some of the greatest challenges we've ever faced. So we have to see which one's going to outrun the other. And
there's no way to predict that right now. In some ways, are we to welcome a federal bankruptcy, given what you just discussed?
Well, frankly, I think it could be one of the best things that ever happened to this country, because it would break the back of all these self-perpetuating bureaucracies that support their own growth more than they support the well-being of the country. And I think it would force people to make priorities. I mean, if it comes down to do we need a Department of Commerce, or should we unplug your grandmother? Well, I think people will take a look at the Department of Commerce for the first time in their lives and say, wait a minute, this whole thing is just dedicated to corporate welfare. I'm pretty sure we could get rid of this and keep my grandmother going. So these are important clarifying moments in our lives, and they're not going to come until they're forced upon us.
So you're saying, just to wrap back around to the OMMP thing, that really what the Oregonians should be doing is looking closely at their local sheriffs rather than even the governor, because it appears that the governor is going to hide under his desk. The Department of Justice is going to hide under their collective desk here, too, and no one will stand up.
Yeah, I would definitely say that. I would say, just because the sheriff could do something and could have a backbone, and a lot of sheriffs are regular, decent people. I think most governors are ambitious and have no principles and can't be depended on. But the sheriff is often a regular guy and can be reasoned with. So that's why I would appeal to him.
All right, Professor Thomas Woods, Jr., Senior Fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Take a look at rollback, buy nullification, look at meltdown. Frankly, add them all to your bookshelf as far as I'm concerned there. And by the way, do you blog on Mises.org?
Once in a while, but more often on my own site, tomwoods.com.
All right, tomwoods.com. We'll link to that, certainly. Professor, a pleasure. Thanks again for coming back on, okay?
My pleasure, Bill. Thank you.
8:29 on AM 1440, KMED.